and thanks for tuning in. I would like to thank the organizers, especially Manu Gustavo, for inviting me to present this research today to you. So before I start, I would like to actually highlight that this is a joint work with Georg Brun from the University of Bern. I guess I'm a little bit more the experimental philosopher guy, whereas Georg is perhaps more the conceptual engineer of the two of us. But so every part of this paper is actually fully collaborative. So I guess most of you would agree with me that Choose had a bit of a rough ride lately. While perhaps a few years or decades ago, it was kind of a feature of statements that wasn't given away that easily. Nowadays, it seems to be almost everywhere, and everyone can say that a certain statement is true. And we have these terms like post-truth and other terms that have appeared within the last few years. Now, there are a few people who put up resistance to this view. For example, fact checkers. So if you consider this kind of rather famous fact checker database looking at what President Trump has said, you see that, well, this was on 3rd of April. President Trump has made 18,000 false or misleading claims. Now, in contrast to that, though, Wiegmann, Rutschmann, and Willemsen in a 2017 paper state that, well, many people argued that Trump could not have lied because nothing he said was false. So there are also people who seem to believe that, well, actually, he didn't actually lie because there was nothing he said that was false. Now, perhaps one of them is completely off, but it seems that perhaps both of these camps are operating with a kind of a different notion of truth. Now, what could this notion be of those people who claim that President Trump doesn't actually make these kind of false claims? Now, let's have a quick look at 4 statements. Let me actually read them out to you. Very sad day and night in Paris. Maybe it's time to end the ridiculous and extremely expensive Paris Agreement and return money back to the people in the form of lower taxes. The Paris Agreement is fatally flawed because it raises the price of energy for responsible countries while whitewashing some of the worst polluters in the world. Because of the Paris Accord, that whole country is burning down, okay? The Paris Agreement isn't working out so well for Paris. Protests and riots all over France. People do not want to pay large sums of money, much to third world countries that are questionably run, in order to maybe protect the environment, chanting, "We want Trump, love France." So if you consider those 4 statements, what seems to be the case is that, while perhaps not being very good at reflecting some parts of reality, they actually mutually support each other. So given a perhaps different notion according to which truth is a matter of coherence, a matter of mutually supporting claims, we might think that is actually what people are talking about when they claim that Trump doesn't make any false claims. Now, this is part of the motivation for this paper and the 2 main questions that Georg and myself raised in it. So first, what is actually the fourth position of truth in the empirical domain? Is it, as most philosophers have suggested, something like correspondence with reality, or do other factors actually play a role? And the second question, well, based on the, so we did run a few empirical results, as the title of the paper suggests. Based on these empirical results, how shall we actually go about re-engineering truth, or maybe we shouldn't actually at all? So this will be the second part of the paper. So I'll first, so this is the program. I will first talk a little bit about monistic and pluralistic theories of truth, give you a bit of a background also for the experimental studies that we've conducted. We are not the first to have done so. So we have a look at a few interesting XY studies already on the false notion of truth. Then I present our studies, and after that, I will make some suggestions on how we might go about re-engineering truths for public discourse and reasoning. All right, so here is the statement we all very well know from not only from philosophical discussions, snow is white. So perhaps the most popular and widely endorsed theory is the correspondence theory, and the correspondence theory will then state something like a statement is true if and only if it corresponds with reality or with the facts. Now, on the pro side of this is that at least many people have argued that it's intuitively correct. So Chalmers and Bourget have actually conducted some studies showing that it is actually the most widely held theory among philosophers. It's also historically dominant, but this theory also has a few issues to grapple with. For example, it needs to answer questions like what are facts or reality, and how does actually this correspondence relation work at all? One of the main contenders to the correspondence theory is the coherence theory. Again, take the statement snow is white, and let's have a look at some of the claims that you might find in the vicinity. So something like on pictures, snow looks white. Other people believe that snow is white. If you put on tinted glasses, snow looks colored. The reflective properties of snow are such and so. So here the idea is that the statement snow is white is true if and only if it coheres with a specific set of other propositions and beliefs. Now, this theory is epistemically very plausible. Think about how you go about trying to find out whether a certain statement is true. If you want to find out whether it's actually true that snow is white, you might actually consider, well, do other people believe that snow is white? What does snow look on pictures, and so on and so forth. But of course, one objection here is that, well, we shouldn't confuse our kind of approach to finding out about the truth of a statement with what is actually making the statement true, right? So, but one might think that this is actually something that still speaks in favor of that theory. On the downside, we have the question, for example, of what shall we say about coherent fictions? And perhaps the most central problem for the coherence theory is answering, well, which set is actually here crucial, right? So the way I've phrased it here as being true in virtue of cohering with a specific set of propositions and beliefs, it's not quite clear which set is actually relevant. Is it my set of other beliefs? Is it the set of an omniscient being? Is it the set of beliefs that are held by experts, and so on? Okay, so unfortunately, hopefully I don't disappoint too many at this stage. I won't go into any other theories. So we will, well, I will at least bracket them from further discussion, but please, if you think that, especially when it comes to the experiments, perhaps other theories can do a good job in explaining the results, you know, feel free to raise these issues. But one more important thing needs to be said about the coherence and the correspondence theory, because of course, at least many have argued that it matters in which domain you actually you consider certain statements to be made. You might as well not be kind of a monist who believes that, well, all statements are true in virtue of the same kind of aspect, but rather you think that it depends on the domain you're looking at. So here's Edwards saying that the basic idea behind all forms of truth pluralism is that the analysis of truth may require different treatments for different kinds of subject matter. So if you consider statements that are made in the empirical domain, for example, a claim like water is H2O or Maria has got a Rolex watch in her safe, many people believe that here the correspondence theory is kind of intuitively correct and makes a good prediction about what matters for these statements to be true. But if you look into the legal, the ethical, or perhaps also the mathematical domain, maybe the coherence theory here is not so quite far off. Consider the statement 11 as a prime number. Many would find it even weird to ask what here the correspondence relation is supposed to be. And if you consider kind of the whole mathematical system and how this supports a certain claim like 11 as a prime number. Many have argued that the coherence theory is the most plausible theory in the mathematical, or take a statement like manslaughter is a felony in the empirical, in the ethical domain. Right. So this is basically the three positions I will consider for the rest of this talk. So correspondence, the correspondence theory, the coherence theory, and pluralism about truth. Now, before I present the experiments we conducted on the fourth notion of truth, first some experimental results that have already played a certain role when it comes to conceptually re-engineering of truth, but also some results that have been basically also an inspiration for our work. So Tarski most famously argues that his definition, his semantic definition of truth, which is an explication of truth, captures the so-called classical conception of truth. And this is in essence the common sense notion of truth. So he believes that the way he explicates truth, in fact, would fulfill the similarity criterion by Carnap, in that it is actually just a specification of a more detailed and more precise version of what we anyway believe is the folk notion of truth. And many people seem to agree, right? So James, for example, says that the popular notion is that a true idea must copy its reality. More recently, Horridge states the common sense notion is that truth is a kind of correspondence with a fact. So many have reiterated that claim that when we look at the way philosophers most commonly use the concept truth, it is actually very similar to the way the folk think about truth. Now, Arne Naess has actually raised several challenges to this position. So he was a precursor of experimental philosophy, and he conducted experimental investigations on people's views of pain. And these seem to reveal actually a plurality of common sense notions of truth. So in a later article, then Tarski actually responds to Naess's challenge and agrees that claims about the use of true in everyday language are subject to empirical investigation. So that doesn't seem to be at issue here, that when someone makes a certain claim regarding the folk notion of truth, we should actually look into do empirical investigations on this. And he even says that this can be done with the help of the statistical questionnaire method. True might as well be ambiguous, and this might then lead us to actually put forward several explications and perhaps also several different terms. Now, how did Naess actually come to this conclusion? So he interviewed about 300 participants, and rather surprisingly and astonishingly, he says the average duration of examining was about 1 hour. No one was examined less than 10 minutes and some more than 10 hours, which is quite hard to believe, but let's go with Naess's approach here. When going through some of the questions he raised, they are often very, very explicit. So for example, he asked questions like, what is the common characteristic of what is true? Now, the results of his study shows that roughly 70% of the answers fall into one of the main groups constructed by philosophers to classify truth theories. So some say, for example, things like it satisfies all parts of one's critical intelligence. That case goes perhaps somewhat in the direction of the coherence theory. It is in agreement with reality. That pretty much reflects the correspondence theory. It serves life. That looks like some kind of things that pragmatists have said. So that's all well well and good, but there are certainly a few problems with Naess's approach. The first I already raised by saying that often he raises these kind of explicit questions. And one might think actually that the concept of truth is quite easily to apply, but perhaps really difficult to articulate. So it's difficult to really know how much weight one wants to put on some of these claims that lay people come up with. So perhaps implicit questions would be better, rather asking, what do you believe is truth? Maybe putting people into a certain situation, asking them whether they would actually use the term truth in that situation. And also that these answers could reflect different views to different domains. So maybe some people thought about the mathematical domain, some people thought about instances and examples in the empirical domain. So that is not very clear from at least many of the interviews that he conducted. Now, more recently, but please correct me if I'm missing something, there's 3 philosophers who have done some empirical investigations on the false notion of truth. Max Köbel, Bernard, and Ulatowski. So Köbel, in a paper in 2008 called Truth is Ambiguous, presented his students with 2 claims. One statement, Ali G is funny. The other one, statements concerning what is funny can't be true or false. And he basically asked his students to tell him whether the statements are true. And what he finds is that many students considered both claims to be true. So in some of the surveys he conducted, he says that over half of the students actually considered both claims to be true. And of course, that seems problematic if you consider that they're dealing here with one notion of truth, right? So if you think that statements concerning what is funny can't be true or false, it would be somehow strange to say that Ali G is funny is true. However, he thinks that, well, there's a way out of solving this problem. People may operate with a notion of truth that is actually ambiguous. So perhaps in some cases, truth can express a deflationary notion. That would be the case in the example with Ali G is funny, and in other instances they operate with a more substantial notion. So true would be ambiguous. Now, his approach has a few advantages over Naess's study. He asked an implicit question. He asked people to say whether the statement is true or false. But there are also a few problems that are similar to Naess's approach. So he basically says that more or less without giving any numbers or statistics, and also having asked his students in lectures, they're not what people consider to be well-controlled conditions. Bernard and Ulatowski, in a series of papers, have approached this more rigorously. So here's one of the studies that I consider quite nice and telling and interesting also for the debate that for the studies that I will present. So they randomly assigned participants to 2 different conditions. So we have one condition, the Anna condition. Anna has performed a simple calculation, discovered that 30 plus 55 is 85, and a Bruno condition. Bruno has just finished painting his house. Bruno painted his house the same color as the sky on a clear summer day. Bruno claims his house is blue. Participants were then asked if a claim reports how the world is, then it is true. And they were supposed to rate this on a kind of a 5-point Likert scale, from 1 totally disagree to 5 fully agree. And you see that also, I think not very surprisingly, that in the Anna condition, where you deal with a mathematical domain, people are less willing to say that a claim reports how the world, or agree to the statement if a claim reports how the world is, then it is true, compared to the Bruno condition. Here, advantages over Naess's study and also over Köbel's studies, controlled conditions and more rigorous statistics. However, in contrast to Köbel and similar to Naess, again, they raised explicit questions, like if a claim reports how the world is, then it is true, which we might consider to be somewhat problematic when you want to find out which kind of notion of truth people actually hold. Okay, So that leads us now to the third part, to the actual experiments that we've conducted ourselves. Now, the starting point for our investigation is that correspondence monists and pluralists typically agree that in the empirical domain, true is used in the sense of correspondence. So the studies we've done are restricted to the empirical domain, and in the empirical domain, correspondence monists and pluralists share this idea that true is used in the sense of correspondence. We wanted to find out exactly whether this is, or whether empirical studies support this idea. So we wanted to find out whether true actually used in everyday language, and how true is used in everyday language in the empirical domain. Here are some specifics of the experiment. I already told you that before. We didn't look into all sorts of different theories. Rather, we focused on the correspondence and the coherence theory of truth. And given that we were somewhat unhappy with explicit questions, we tried to examine the common sense concept implicitly through language use. And also we used controlled conditions. How did we do that? We basically recruited people, participants on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and asked them to respond to the questions we asked them. Now, one caveat in advance, I will from now on speak less about correspondence theory and coherence theory, but correspondentists and coherentists. The reason is that I don't think, and I want to limit here what I'm saying to basically what kind of the central aspects that the correspondence theory and the coherence theory will basically put forward as a prediction for the result. But of course, many, perhaps especially some coherence theorists, will not quite agree with that the predictions that I say a coherentist would make, they would actually fully endorse. Especially when it comes to the coherence theory, there's many different claims, especially regarding the set. That needs to be kind of that mutually support a certain claim. Okay. So here's the first scenario. I just read it out to you and then explain what the basic idea behind the vignette was. So Maria is a watch collector. She keeps all her watches in a safe and knows her collection really well. One day, her friend John asks her whether she has a 1990 Rolex Submariner in a safe, and if so, could show it to him. Maria answers that she's got a 1990 Rolex Submariner in a safe. After all, she had purchased that watch a few years ago. When Maria opens the safe a little later, she finds out that a burglar has stolen several watches, among them the 1990 Rolex Submariner. And the question that was then raised was Maria's answer true or false? Now, if you look at the first bit of information that we presented to participants, you see that the story basically told is such that the answer that Maria gives is actually coherent with the set of beliefs she holds, or is supposed to hold regarding the matter of the Rolex watch. So Maria answers that she's got the watch in her safe. After all, she had purchased that watch a few years ago. The second bit, starting with when Maria opens the safe, basically is supposed to tell people, well, but the answer she gives does not correspond to the way the world really is, right? So we have answer is coherent with what she knows, but it's actually not corresponding to reality. So when you then look at the question, what was Maria's answer true or false? Correspondentists should actually predict that people will largely say her answer is false. After all, right? The watch was stolen. It's not in the safe anymore. Correspondentists should say that Maria's answer is false. Coherentists should say something like her answer is true because her answer is coherent with her set of other beliefs about the watch. We also tested the second case, the party scenario, because we wanted to know how robust our results actually are. So let me just read out to you again. Anne and Robert go to a party late at night. On their way to the party, Anne asks Robert whether any of his friends are at the party. Robert answers that Jill is at the party because Jill had told Robert a few hours before that she would go. So same situation, coherence seems to be satisfied. When they arrive at the party, it turns out that Jill had changed her plans and actually followed the party. So her answer doesn't seem to correspond to reality. Same predictions here. The correspondentist should say false. The coherentist should say true. So here are the results of this first batch of experiments. As you can see, a majority of people actually endorse the claim that the answer is true, which is in line with the coherentist prediction. So if you consider the Rolex case and the party case, slightly different numbers, but more or less a majority of the participants say that the answer is true, which should come at least prima facie as a surprise. For the correspondentists, they might have interesting objections to raise, and I will raise a few myself. Before I do that, let me basically look at a reverse scenario that we did. So we also wanted to find out what is actually the case if we have a no coherence information that her answer is not coherent, but actually corresponds to reality. So again, Maria is a watch collector. She keeps all the watches in the safe and knows the collection really well. One day, her friend John asks her whether she has a 1990 Rolex Submariner in the safe, and if so, could show it to him. Maria answers that she hasn't got a 1990 Rolex Submariner in the safe, despite the fact that Maria purchased that watch a few years ago, a piece of information that Maria completely forgot in that moment. When Maria opens the safe a little later, she finds out that a burglar has stolen several watches, among them the 1990 Rolex Submariner. Again, the question was Maria's answer true or false? Here now, the correspondentist should say true, because what she says corresponds to reality. However, it's actually, at least in some sense, not coherent with a set of other beliefs about the watch, so the coherentist should make a prediction that her answer is false. Again, we ran the same with the party scenario. I'm not going into that now. Here are the results of the second batch of studies. So a little bit more complex, because in the party case, the results for the party case seem to suggest that the correspondence theory is preferred, whereas in the Rolex case, a majority seem to be giving coherentist answers. So a little bit more complex. It might depend a little bit on the exact information that was given. However, and that is the most important takeaway from these studies, it doesn't seem to be the case that there is a clear case of one theory being more dominant than the other, right? Rather, it seems that we have a lot of variance here in the response. Some people seem to answer in line with coherentist predictions. Other people seem to answer in line with correspondentist predictions. Now, one objection you might have in mind when you read these scenarios is that, well, this is all nice and well, but you can only draw conclusions about the false notion of truth if people really answer the question about truth and not about some other concept. So perhaps what people did was really answer a question about truthfulness, right? So maybe participants actually considered that question and actually just wanted to say something like, well, actually, she answered to the best of her knowledge. Or maybe people didn't want to come across as saying something like, Maria actually lied. So a very common approach to try to avoid such a kind of a substitution of one question with a question that is perhaps easier to answer is to basically ask that question before you ask the other question. So what we did is we ran the exact same experiment, but this time we had one group of people just receiving the question, was Maria's answer true or false? The other group of participants first answered the question, did Maria answer the question to the best of her knowledge? Yes, no. And in fact, actually everybody answered yes here to that question. And then we asked the question, was Maria's answer true or false? Like that, we can at least minimize the likelihood that people would substitute the was Maria's answer true or false question with a question about whether she lied or whether she answered to the best of her knowledge. So here on the left, we've got the responses to the original question. We even got even more answers in line with the coherence predictions. And now we do see a substantial drop. So we do see that the percentage drops from 71% to roughly 51%. So it does seem to have some effect on the results. However, at the same time, it's still the case that we have even a majority here of people answering in line with the coherence prediction. So while there might as well be an effect here, it's not the case that this erases the worries that the correspondents have with saying that, okay, so, well, now we get to 10 or 20%. No, it's still a substantial amount of people answer that Maria's question was true. We also asked people to explain their responses because we thought that, well, maybe people just give any kind of response without really thinking a bit about these questions. And maybe when we look at people's explanations, we don't find any really good evidence that suggests that different notions, different thought notions might be operative here. But when we looked at the answers that were given when a coherentist response was selected, we very often, at least, of course, some answers didn't really tell us a lot, but surprisingly many people actually made a great effort in explaining their responses. And we find that when people give a coherentist response, they say things like, it was true based on the information she had at the time. Maria was telling the truth based upon the information she knew at the time. According to her knowledge, the answer was true. It is true based upon the reports. So while perhaps coherence theorists might itself think that is not enough to say people have a coherence or people think in terms of the coherence theory, it does seem to fulfill one of the central aspects of the coherence of coherence theory, namely that what matters for people to say that an answer is true or false is that the statement is coherent with some other beliefs one has about this matter. When we look at the explanations when it comes to the correspondentist responses, we find, and that was not very surprising, people say that the answer was false because there wasn't a watch there. The watch was stolen, so she doesn't really own it anymore. Maria's response was factually incorrect, even though she thought it was correct. The statement was false because it was not in her safe. So this quite nicely suggests that people actually think the question through and answer quite in line with what we would have predicted. The second objection, and this is the last experiment that I will present. The second objection is that perhaps, again, people didn't really answer a question about truth or falsity, but rather a question about true for. So especially in the English language, it's quite common to say things like, it is true for her, or it is true for him. And that is, of course, a subjectivized notion that we're not really after, right? So in order to tackle this objection, we didn't actually use the same kind of approach. We didn't first ask, was Maria's answer true for her? And then was Maria's answer true? That would have probably really confused people. What we did is we asked an alternative question, was Maria's answer correct? Because the correct notion doesn't really lend itself, at least not in the English language, to the idea that something is correct for someone. So when we looked at a different corpora, we didn't actually find a single instance that people talk like that. However, these results need to be taken with a grain of salt because what exactly is meant with correct is, of course, up for grabs. Perhaps when it comes to correctness, this already biases people into thinking quite in a correspondence fashion. But anyway, we thought this would be a nice kind of control for us to see what people would answer to the question, was Maria's answer correct? Here are the results again. So this is again compared to the original scenario. So we had basically three conditions. We had the original one, we had the truthfulness group, and we had the true for group. And again, you see that there is a drop in answers along the coherentist lines, but far from suggesting that there is not substantial variance and that not two different factors actually play an important role for people to answer that question. I don't want to put too much weight on the second. Maybe you have different suggestions on how to go about testing this kind of objection in a better way. I'm not so happy with this kind of correctness variation, but that might be one way of trying to tackling it. Okay, so what are the basic outcome of our experiments? We believe that both correspondence and coherence are significant predictors of the use of true in everyday language in the empirical domain. So again, we don't want to go so far in thinking this supports the coherence theory or this supports the correspondence theory or pluralism or whatever. What we want to say is that there is some substantial variance in the use of true within the empirical domain. And that is indeed a challenge for both monism and scope pluralism, because no one really thinks that in the empirical domain, both of these factors matter for basically people's responses, whether a statement is true or false. We also, as a kind of a side remark, find very small number of not sure answers. So in the first two batch of experiments, people were able to select I'm not sure, and we find that very few people actually select this, which tentatively suggests that vagueness is hardly an issue. So it doesn't seem to be the case that many people are really torn here between this and think that this is a vague matter. All right, so let's get to the last part of this talk, namely, well, what are we supposed to do now, given that we have these empirical results on the false notion of truth in the empirical domain? And Georg and myself are particularly interested in making a few suggestions on what this means for re-engineering truth for public discourse and reasoning. Before I say more about that, just a couple of remarks on what we believe XPhi, experimental philosophy, can actually contribute to conceptual engineering. So these are not very original remarks. Other people have made these. Several authors have discussed them, especially in the last few years. But what we take our research to show is that this is quite illustrative about these aspects, and suggests that experimental philosophy can do a lot for conceptual engineering projects. So perhaps most central for experimental philosophy is that it can help clarify the explicandum. So what our experiments were supposed to do is namely to describe how the explicandum term is actually used and to identify ambiguities, vagueness, and perhaps other inconsistencies. Now, that allows us then, of course, to test key assumptions of available explications, right? So, and when we look at the results of our experiments and the interpretations we draw, of course, you might have some doubts about this, but if we follow the interpretation of the experiment that we suggest, then the use of, so it's actually, the claim is wrong that the use of true in everyday language is uniform in the empirical domain. And what this means is for correspondentist explications that their scope was actually perhaps way more limited. And that when we're interested in re-engineering truth, explications of coherence may be way more relevant than so far has been considered. Okay, so now the second question that I wanted to raise is, what are we now supposed to do? And of course, we're not the first to consider Q as a target for conceptual engineering, right? So this discussion has been discussed in the context of the projects that aim at developing a formally rigorous account of truth. For example, Tarski ended up dealing with Liar-style paradoxes, and Kevin Sharp's work. Now, given the fundamental importance of truth in various areas like science, political discourse, legal discourse, everyday matters, and philosophy, we believe that the ambiguity we found is also a reason for conceptual re-engineering, although the relevant concerns seem to be more about everyday and public discourse. So we don't think that what we found has a lot of bearing, perhaps, on some specific philosophical discussions that people will have on the notion of truth, but more relevant for everyday reasoning and public discourse. So what kind of strategies do we have? It seems that when we consider our results, we have three different strategies, perhaps more, but I just want to consider three strategies. One would be to say, let's go ahead with one simple target concept. The second would be to say, well, all right, so there are two different factors that play a role in our use of the term true. What we need is somehow a multidimensional target concept, but still it's one target concept. And the third strategy would be to suggest that the best way to go ahead actually would be to have two target concepts, one along the coherence line and one along the correspondence line. So here's what these strategies look in more detail. So take strategy one, we have one, the term true, and we find in our experiments that it's used in a correspondentist fashion and in a coherentist fashion. And one might now think, no, there's just one target concept that we, so our engineering should focus on one target concept. And then, of course, you still have a choice which term you actually want to use for that target concept. Perhaps we go ahead with the term true, or perhaps it's better to introduce a new term altogether. The second strategy, again, we have our expression true and two different uses, correspondentist and coherentist. But this is slightly different in that it tries to amalgamate these kind of different uses into one target concept. Again, you would have to consider whether the term true is reserved for the target concept or whether you would like to introduce a new term. And thirdly, one might suggest we have, given that we have a correspondentist use and a coherentist use, let's have two target concepts, and then we can decide which of these target concepts the term true is supposed to express, or perhaps it might be better to actually have two completely different terms. So which of these kind of three strategies shall we use? Well, it primarily depends, of course, on the engineer's objective and the addressed domain. So if we consider what this means for the empirical sciences, perhaps focus on correspondence seems actually appropriate, because it's not that important how everyday language works. Scientists can agree that they will use just the correspondence concept and use the term true to express exactly this notion. So here, strategy one might be the right strategy. In mathematics, perhaps coherence is of core interest, but Platonists, of course, suggest that you can make sense of the correspondence theory even in the mathematical domain. So perhaps strategy one or strategy three might be favorable. But now we get to the domain we're mostly interested in. So what about public everyday discourse? So given that we are interested to improve public discourse and reasoning, we should provide tools for reducing sources of misunderstanding and confusion. We should provide the tools also for perhaps a self-critical kind of expressions. So perhaps when it comes to correspondence, the relevant criteria are empirical evidence, and when it comes to coherence, it's rather more support by basic commitments and background assumptions. So the starting point is basically the empirical data that I've presented. So coherentist and correspondentist uses are important. So both are targets of conceptual reengineering, but of course we can still decide that one of them is not on the right track. So let's go through the three different strategies. Remember, strategy one was to say we just need one simple target concept. For example, the correspondentist concept. And here basically there are perhaps kind of two different versions how you might go about strategy one. One is the perhaps more traditional version to say, well, let's ignore other uses of true. And this might be an understandable approach if you don't know about the empirical data. But if the empirical data tell us something viable about the thought notion of truth, then of course this would just contribute to the confusion. So perhaps a more aggressive version of strategy one would be to say, no, we need to reject these kind of coherentist uses of truth. One reason might be that you just think that people are completely on the wrong kind of track, or for some other purposes, it's not a very good idea. Be highly revisionist, right? Because acknowledging that people use the term true in a coherentist fashion, and then just saying that we should reject them altogether seems to be quite radical. And perhaps more importantly, there is no reason to actually criticize considerations of coherence as such, right? So most philosophers are happy to at least acknowledge that coherence does play a certain role, at least in some domains. So when we now find out that coherence also matters in the empirical domain, to just basically reject these kind of uses seems to be a talk. Okay. Perhaps strategy 2 would be better, and it is at least better in the sense that it does take correspondence and coherence seriously, right? So because it is a multidimensional target concept, we have just one concept of truth, but we try to basically integrate both the correspondentist and the coherentist uses. However, there's also a few problems with this approach. First, how exactly one goes about engineering a multidimensional target concept seems to be very unclear. So is it the case that we should give correspondence a weight of 0.7 and coherence a weight of 0.3? Or rather differently, what about when the stakes change? What about different kind of personal factors that might play a role here? So it seems that this approach is, at least we can't see a way through to make this, to get to a multidimensional target concept that is clear and plausible. So that's why we believe strategy 3 is actually the most promising. What we do need is 2 target concepts. We want to improve public discourse and reasoning involving true. And it's not the case that we haven't got the tools, right, the linguistic tools already for engineering these 2 target concepts, right? We have notions such as correspondence to facts, coherence, justification, confirmation that we can actually use in engineering the 2 target concepts. So we believe we should insist on distinguishing correspondence and coherence uses of truth. And instead of continuing to use the term true, which might express one or the other notion, we want to suggest that it is, in order to reduce confusion, in order to further public discourse and reasoning, to actually use different terms. So, for example, instead of saying that it is true that France is in turmoil, we should say things like it is a fact that France is in turmoil. If we rather want to talk about the coherence use, we should say things like the claim that France is in turmoil fits with Trump's beliefs, for example. Applying this to the case that we use in the vignette, we should not say Maria's answer was true or false, but rather Maria's answer was coherent with what she knew. But the fact is that, of course, that the 1990 rule of Mariner was not in her safe. So 2 target concepts and 2 different expressions, or expressions that are supposed to, 2 different terms that are supposed to express these 2 target concepts. Right, so here are some conclusions. The experiment suggests that we have a pluralistic use of true in everyday language in the empirical domain. Both correspondence and coherence matter. Contemplating the contributions that experimental philosophy can deliver for conceptual engineering, it seems that our research illustrates how basic assumptions about a concept can be basically revealed by running studies on people's use, by looking at what the fault notion of a certain concept is. And thirdly, when it comes to re-engineering truth, the strategy that you use depends on the engineer's objectives and the addressed domain. And when it comes to improve public discourse and reasoning, we suggest that you're better off having two new target terms, not completely new. We have at our disposals already good terms that we can use, and this would reduce further confusion in everyday talk and thought. Thank you very much.